Welcome, everybody, to this week's episode. We really appreciate you joining us. This podcast is intended to help us learn, live, and thrive in our own personal context. By sharing knowledge through our conversations, we will impart some knowledge while learning ourselves how to progress even further. I'm your host, Dawn Jones, and you can participate in this conversation with me by sending a voicemail through DawnJonesSpeaks.com and commenting on the episode after the show. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe. Let's have a conversation. Wow, here we are with another episode. And just like every other episode, I'm always excited to be on here. I'm really having fun with this podcast, and I enjoy bringing you content each week. I even enjoy doing research for some of the topics that we discuss from week to week. And this week, we are going to be talking about conflict resolution. And it so happens that, in my opinion, conflict resolution ought to be something that is taught in schools. I think there ought to be a class for that. I don't know how long I am guessing the class should be, but I do think there ought to be at least a class for conflict resolution, or conflict resolution skills ought to be taught regularly in the school system. Generally speaking, many of us had our parents as our first role models for what conflict resolution looks like. And if they modeled great communication and conflict resolution skills, then chances are we will be good at resolving conflict as well. However, it's likely that no matter how possible it might be, it probably did not happen for one reason or another. People struggle and we don't always get it right. It was a long time before I heard the term conflict resolution as a skill. Before then, I had no idea that conflict resolution would be considered a skill, but I do believe that it is a skill. There is a skill to conflict resolution. And from the daily news reports, we can safely assume that many people have no idea how to effectively resolve conflict in nonviolent ways. I don't want that to be you. I don't want that to be me. And I don't want that to be us. And that is why I want to talk about it today. But first, let's take some time to think about who the first person was that we saw model some sort of conflict resolution technique, whether the technique was good or bad. What did you learn from these individuals about how to resolve a conflict? Do you emulate any of those conflict resolution techniques in your own life? Why or why not? Some of you may have just had an aha moment right there. It's quite all right. Today, we will talk about ways we can minimize the chances of being in frequent conflicts, learn to clarify perceptions, resolve conflict with open communication, and effectively diffuse conflicts when they do arise. Stay tuned.
Do you have a message that the rest of the world should hear? Become a podcaster. Anchor is the easiest way to make a podcast. Anchor gives you everything you need in one place for free, which you can use right from your smartphone or computer. Anchor's creation tools allow you to record and edit your podcast before publication, and they will even distribute your podcast for you. Get your message heard on popular media outlets such as Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and many more. You can even make money, and there's no minimum listenership to qualify. Get started today by downloading the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started.
If you never noticed conflict in your relationships, you probably have by now with the current pandemic. Family tensions and conflict generally arise during times of change of some sort. Even the smallest of change can provoke a huge fight, which is indicative of a deeper issues going on that may have been just below the surface. So how do we minimize those outbreaks in order to keep the peace in our homes and with our friends? The first thing we can do is practice appreciating one another. That looks different for each and every one of us, depending on what our love language is. Think about why you love each other and ask yourself if the current crisis is worth losing the relationship over. One thing that would help is to determine what your priorities are in your relationship. And then think about what your boundaries are surrounding your relationship interactions. If you are making a request of your loved one, think about your reasons behind the request that you're making so that you can negotiate more effectively. If you don't know the why of your request, then chances are the why will be whatever your loved one perceives it to be. And you have probably heard of the phrase, people's perceptions become their reality. I would tend to agree with this statement. Our perceptions color the way that we see the world. And this is why in our relationships, we have to bring our perceptions out into the open so that we can decide whether to keep them or to change them. One way to do this is to change the way that you see conflict. Instead of focusing on past issues and dredging up old complaints to continue a vicious cycle, make every attempt to resolve the issue. This might mean acknowledging resentments and agreeing to forgive in order to focus on the present. When there is a present issue involved, define the major issue. It is really easy to attribute frustrations to incorrect causes. Your loved one may think the issue is one thing, while you may think you are in disagreement about another. And as you seek common ground on the shared issue, then shift your attention to the shared objectives. It could be that you both want the same thing, but are expressing different ways of going about achieving the same result. It would also be helpful to clarify needs and wants in the situation. This way, you know where it is best to negotiate. It could be that after prioritizing and separating the needs from the wants, that you could then come to an agreement and break the issue down into smaller, more manageable parts. I think it's important for me to note that I'm being general in my statements, and I know that I'm going by these pretty fast, but I wanted to be very general and go over these topics so that you can take whatever principles that you feel that you might be able to use and apply them to your situation. There's no one size fits all to resolving conflicts and issues, but there are some things that can be done to aid in those efforts. And so I didn't want to spend too much time on these topics, giving examples or anything of that nature, because I've also created some extra content on my website at DawnJonesSpeaks.com in order for you to have a visual and in order for you to be able to put some of these things into practice. Not to mention, there is one-on-one coaching available to you. So let's continue. Now, let's talk a little bit about open communication. Not only do we want to change the way that we see conflict, but we want to change the way that we see each other. When we demonize the other person, it makes it more difficult to reach common ground. This is why we have to practice being honest about our part in the conflict. And it might be uncomfortable to admit what we did to help facilitate the friction, but sometimes it is necessary to acknowledge our part in order to bring the temperature down in the room. It is then that we can see pathways to negotiate a resolution. One of the hardest things to do in the midst of conflict is to listen with an open mind. Even if we can stop defending ourselves long enough to truly answer back with our position instead of a question. Let me rephrase that. It's very hard. It is extremely hard to listen with an open mind and to listen without trying to think about a comeback or how we're going to defend ourselves or answer back just as soon as it's our turn. But I found that one of the better ways to get towards a resolution is, instead of trying to defend myself, instead of trying to come back with a comeback, is to ask a question instead. Asking questions for further information or clarification is far more productive than answering with a defense all of the time. By asking questions, you give your loved one the opportunity to feel truly heard. Think about what you've heard so far, what you might be able to immediately apply to your situation. I encourage you to listen to this podcast more than once and take notes if you have to. As I said before, resolving conflict is a skill. We're all practicing it. It takes practice to head off conflicts as well as clarify what the conflict is apart from our differing perceptions of it. Now, let's suppose that you are already in a full-blown conflict and things seem pretty bad. It's not too late to try to resolve the conflict in some instances. Let me say this: conflicts are a part of life. None of us agree or have the same opinions on things all of the time. None of us perceive situations the same way all of the time. It used to be common to say that there are 3 sides to every story: your side, my side, and the truth. There can be several eyewitnesses to the same event, and it's not uncommon to get 3 different accounts of the one event. The question then becomes, what are the facts? Because sometimes our minds tend to fill in the blanks for things we are unsure of. That brings us back to what I said earlier about perceptions. Our communications have to be open enough with our loved one that we can put our perceptions of the event on the table. It might sound like this: XYZ happened, and that made me feel like ABC because I understood what happened to be DEF. Is that how you meant it? This way, you remove the accusations, threats, and other facets of the argument, and both parties can calmly clarify or restate their position. Now, that was a little bit of a difficult sentence perhaps to understand, so let me repeat it. So, a different way. So, for example, if you are in a conflict and XYZ happens and it made you feel some type of way, then you express that to the other person, tell them how it made you feel and how you understood or perceived that situation, and then you follow it up with a question. Is that how you meant it? Or is that what you meant? With some sort of clarifying question so that you can remove the accusation and the threats out of the situation and have a better chance at getting to a solution. If the temperature of the conflict is at a boiling point, face-to-face confrontation may not be the best option. In these instances, a phone conversation or other method might be more appropriate. There might be times where there should be a pause for a cooling off point. That is okay too. Do what it takes to not make the other person feel nervous or attacked. This is especially important if you have authority over the other person. You want to always aim at fixing the problem and not dragging it on or substituting one problem for another. Like anything else, this too will take time. Be patient with yourself and your loved ones. The more frequent you use these conflict resolution approaches that fit your situation, the easier it will become and the more peaceful your life can be. And finally, I want to talk about diffusing conflict. I want to give you a few quick tips on how to diffuse a conflict quickly. If you see that tensions become high in a situation, you can break the tension by either calling for a timeout to allow everyone a chance to get a drink of water or take a bathroom break. Or, depending on the situation, laughter can diffuse tension quickly too. If the conflict centers on two opinions, then perhaps Googling a reputable source and getting facts might diffuse the situation. I had to practice this in a situation where two people were sharing their opinions about an organization, but they were talking as if their opinions were fact. One individual was blatantly lying, and I knew it. However, I didn't need to join in on the argument. I simply said, well, this is a situation that can easily be resolved. Let's actually go to their webpage and look at their About section. It will tell us exactly what they do and what they are about. Now, needless to say, the conversation was over after that. No more opinions flying back and forth, and no more lies masquerading as truth. The conversation was resolved with facts. And after you have done the best that you could do to clarify, understand the problem, fix the problem, the next step is finding solutions that are equitable for both of you. That's apart from situations where you can easily resolve it with facts and Googling it, just like I just gave you an example of. What can be done so that both parties can feel satisfied with the outcome? How can you work together to fix the problem? If the problem cannot be fixed right away, what steps toward resolution can be worked on immediately? After both parties have committed to follow through, if either party doesn't follow through and doesn't adhere to their end of resolving the conflict, then there's a risk of one side feeling grieved. We don't want this to happen. We want to do as much as we can to resolve conflict, to prevent conflicts from happening, to reach equitable solutions so that both parties feel comfortable with the solution focus. We don't want anyone, if at all possible, to not keep their end of the bargain, because then we've entered a whole new cycle of conflict. Did you get something out of what you heard on this week's podcast episode? Well, the answer is simple. It would mean the world to us if you could head over to DawnJonesSpeaks.com and leave us a 5-star review and some feedback. Spreading the word really is the best way to grow our podcast and achieve even greater things. A special note to our members: be sure to check for free downloadable content. If you're not a member of the podcast, it's not too late to support and join in on the fun. Members get free downloadable content with exercises, articles, and fun stuff. Think of it as self-paced coaching that you have access to each month. Thank you for listening. See you next week.